Hi, this is Muho from Osaka, and today I want to continue with the My Teacher's House series. First of all, sometimes people remind me that YouTube video shouldn't be longer than 10 or 15 minutes. And well, this video will not fit into this category. I admire people who are able to express themselves in a compact way. But, well, I tend to need a little bit more time to, well, think about things and also express them. Also, it has to do with the fact that I don't edit these videos, so I apologize to all of those who would like to have it a little bit more compact, but as you know, nobody's forced to watch this video until the end. Before I continue to read the text of the interview that I did with Edward Moore almost exactly a year ago, in the winter of 2019, I would like to say some things about Zen in Japan. Probably quite a good amount of the viewers already know that, but there might still be some who don't, so I say it once more. Zen in Japan is quite different from Zen as it is practiced in the West, and Zen temples and Zen monasteries are quite different here in Japan from the average Zen center in the West. Sometimes people think that a Zen temple in Japan must be something like San Francisco Zen Center or the dojo in Paris or London in Berlin, but everything more Japanese, more authentic. And that's not the case. Zen centers, as we know them from the West, practically do not exist in Japan. There's roughly two different categories of temples that you have in Japanese Zen. The first category, and almost all, I would say 99% of the temples fit into that category, are well, normal temples that you can find in the cities and also in the countryside. Almost every village has at least one of these small temples. In the Soto sect, which is one of the two Zen sects in Japan, there are 15,000 of these temples. In the Rinzai, there are 3,000. And most of these temples have been founded during or before the Tokugawa period. And the Tokugawa period lasted from 1600 to 1868. I think that, well, more than 90% of the temples in Japan today are more than 300 years old. And during the Tokugawa period, they functioned not only as Zen temples and centers for practice, but rather than that, they were also the village offices, the town offices. They functioned as schools. So the Zen priest was also a teacher for the community. He was something like a public servant. I'm not quite sure if he was also responsible for making people pay their taxes, but I could imagine that even that was the case. That the priest was the local representative of the Tokugawa regime in Japan. So the temples were very important, both for the state and also for the community. And marriages were registered there, births were registered in the temple, deaths were registered there, and that a priest would also do the funerals. And when the Japanese political system changed in 1868, the Tokugawa period ended and the Meiji period started, the state and Buddhism were separated, and from then on, there were public schools, they had town offices that were independent from the temples, and the only thing that the priests continued to do were the funerals. And also, until then, the state required of the priests that they keep to the precepts, to the Buddhist precepts. That means that if a Zen monk would drink alcohol, for example, he would commit a criminal offense and could be legally punished for that. Also, priests, except the Pure Land priests, but all of the Zen priests were required to stay celibate by law. And in 1868, this law was also abolished. So all of the priests were now free to drink alcohol, eat meat, and marry if they wanted to. And a lot of priests actually did that. So that was when Japanese Buddhists started to marry and have kids, even the priests in the temples. And now, if you visit such an average Japanese temple, one of these 15,000s, and you ask the priest, why did you become a priest? The answer will almost always be, why? Why? I don't understand your question. I was born in the temple. I had no other choice. Which surprises some Westerners, because for us this is a big decision. If you shave your head, you become a monk. It's not that you were born a Buddhist, or maybe now there are some second generation Buddhists in the West as well, but usually most of us in the West who become Buddhists, it's their own decision, and you spend a lot of time and you spend your own money to go to retreats. Why do you do it? Well, it's for your own spiritual growth. You have a question that you want to solve. Maybe you were inspired by the books of spiritual teachers. Maybe you read Dogen and found something in there. And then you come to Japan and you're surprised that few of the priests even read Dogen. Of course, they know Dogen. He's the founder of the school, but they don't read the Shobo Genzo. There is no spiritual quest. There is not this life and death question. So few of them actually practice Zazen. They may offer a Zazen meeting every once a month or so, but that's more as a kind of service for the parish. And even these temples or these monthly sittings are rare. So few temples offer meditation. And then there's a second category of Zen temples, or those are the ones that you could call Zen monasteries in a stricter sense. Those are kind of training seminaries for future priests. Both in the Soto sect and in the Rinzai sect, you have about 30 something, less than 40, but more than 30. And there's a teacher there, a Roshi, who oversees the practice, who will give Dharma talks. In Rinzai, that would be the person with whom you have koan exchanges. And there's a number of training monasteries, usually in the head temples in Soto. That would be Eheji and Sojeji. There are dozens, while in the local training monasteries sometimes there's only 2 or 3. Who are these training monks? In the most cases, they are the sons of the small temples that are already mentioned. To get your license as a priest and to take over your father's temple, you need to train for at least 1 year in Soto, and in Rinzai it's 3 years. You can get around that 3-year rule in Rinzai as well, but if you want to be able to wear a purple robe, you need 3 years in Rinzai, and in Rinzai if you cannot wear the purple robe, you're not considered a full-fledged Rinzai priest. So that's why in Rinzai they stay longer. So you need to go to that seminary to get your license. And few people stay longer than the minimum amount. So in Soto, most people leave after 1 year, but if you stay longer, you get some extra credit. You can rise in the hierarchy. So some people stay longer because of certain advantages that they can get because of that. Now, to which category does Antaiji belong? Because basically all of the temples belong in either of these 2 categories. There are very few exceptions. And well, Antaiji is actually one of these exceptions. For one, Antaiji's history is about only 100 years old. So it's one of a very small number of temples that have been founded after the Meiji restoration in 1868. Most temples, as I said, have a history of 300 years or longer. Antaiji is very young, and because of that, it doesn't have a parish. So Antaiji is one of the few temples where we don't do funeral services. At the same time, also, you don't get a license for practicing Antaiji. You can't do the training to become an authorized Soto priest. So even though you practiced at Antaiji for a decade, you still have to go to one of these priest seminaries if you want to get your license. And that's what I'm going to talk about later in the My Teacher's House series. Monks who ordain and practice at Antaiji don't get anything out of that. Well, Sawaki famously says Zazen doesn't bring you anywhere, doesn't get you anything, but you don't even get a license at Antaiji for that. You also don't learn how to do a funeral. And the people who come to Antaiji are also kind of, at least in the Japanese environment, kind of exceptions in that they were usually not born in a temple. None of my Dharma brothers was born in a temple. While that's the typical Japanese case. You were born in a temple, and that's why you do Zen practice for a small number of years, and then you return to the temple and take over your father's job. So Antaiji is an exception that it tries to aim at a Zen practice environment, maybe quite similar to what Dogen did at his time, with a small number of motivated people who aim at the way, who don't try to gain from the practice. Also, Antaiji is special in the way that it tries to be self-sufficient. It's said that the Chinese Zen monasteries during the Tang and Song dynasties were self-sufficient, but the self-sufficiency model never really grew in Japan, and I'm not sure how serious the Chinese monks were about it at their time. I have the feeling that they had a large amount of laborers, basically that lived on the land and worked for them, and the monks were more or less overseeing the laborers. Either way, so Hantaiji among the Japanese temples and monasteries is one of the few which is in a way maybe close to the Western model of Zen. You have a small number of people who live there because of their own decision. And then there's people who come for shorter times. Maybe only for sesshin, or maybe to try to find out if it's the alternative that they look for in their lives. In the past, in Antaiji, we would keep the doors open all the time. People could come and go when they wanted. They needed to work like everyone else, but you didn't have to pay. And I changed that a number of years ago. I explained the reason a number of times, but once more, it's basically it's difficult to sustain the place if there's people going through all the time, and for some of them it's not exactly like couch surfing, but they needed a cheap alternative to staying in a youth hostel in Japan, and they also maybe want to spend a week in the Zen monasteries. They read about it, they heard about Antaiji, so they want to use that opportunity. But to really help with the work, you have to stay longer. So that's why I now say, well, stay for 3 years if you come, and for that you need to learn the language. So that's the new rule. You can come, but the minimum stay should be 3 years, and you should be able to communicate in the language of the country you're going to. And now we also have the option that you participate in a retreat, but unlike before, it's not for free anymore, but you have to pay for the retreat, like in most Western Zen centers. Now, in the next part of the interview with Edward Moore, I'm gonna talk about my own experiences in some of these other priest seminaries. I went first to a Rinzai training monastery in Kyoto, and after that to a Soto training monastery. And as I said, all of the Antaiji monks, if they want to, at one point, want to be certified Zen masters, they need to undergo that training. There's no rule at Antaiji when you do that. You can ordain at Antaiji and go right at once if you want to, but most people come to Antaiji to practice at Antaiji. So nobody really comes with the idea, I want to get my license as fast as possible. So usually people stay at Antaiji for a couple of years, and then they go to the monastery, and then maybe they come back to Antaiji for another while. And at one point, when the teacher and the student together decide it's time to move, then the student will move on. Now, what happens when you go to a priest seminary? At first, even though you heard about it, again, there's this surprise. All of the Japanese there, and it's mostly Japanese in the average Zen monasteries. There's some who take a lot of foreigners, but all of the others, it's quite probably you'll be the only foreigner if you go there as a foreigner. Of course, to go there as a foreigner, you need to speak Japanese again. So the big surprise, all of your Dharma brothers are there to get the license. They have been born in the temple of their father. As the oldest son, they had no other choice. So they have no interest in Zazen. They have no intention to continue with the practice once they go back to their father's temples. They just have to take responsibility for the temple building, for doing funerals. So there's this tendency to look down on these people. And you think, or at least I thought at first, well, I'm a real Buddhist here. I'm a way seeker. I'm into this business because, I want to drop body and mind and give everything to Zazen. But now look at these other guys. They're only here for the career. For them, it's only a career step. And it took me a while to see the other side, the other perspective. Like, for many of us in the West, what is Zen really for us? If you look around, if you surf around on the internet and look at people who are Zen practitioners or even Zen teachers, you find all these guys who are, first of all, life coaches. They have a PhD in psychology from the University of Wisconsin. They're also certified yoga instructors. And by the way, they also have Dharma certification from 3 different Zen teachers and another Lama in the Dzogchen tradition. They probably invested a lot of their precious time and money into their training, and it's great that they share their wisdom now with the rest of the world. But probably everybody can see there's a small problem when Zen becomes basically just another line in your CV, so to speak. By the way, I'm also a certified Zen teacher. And even people who go to Japan for a longer stretch of time, once they go back to the West, I spent 1 year at a Zen monastery. There I spent 2 years. That's here me at Antaiji. That's me shaking hands with the Dalai Lama. Instagram Zen masters. And when you go to a training monastery in Japan, of course, none of the Japanese monks belonging to those in the category. They're only there to eventually take over their father's temple. But when you think about it, like 200 years, 300 years ago, maybe even in the West, the first son of a farmer had to take over the farm. The son of a smith had to become a smith. It was the same in Japan, but today in Japan, it's only the son of the emperor who has no choice than to become the next emperor by law. It's the first son of the present emperor who's going to be the next emperor. He has no choice. He cannot refuse. And the only other people that also have no choice are the priest's sons. To make that step and to say, if I had been born as the second son, or if I had been born as the daughter, I would be free to, just like my peers in school, chase my dreams. But I'm gonna shoulder that load and take over my father's temple. I mean, that's a huge decision. There might be no interest in Zen practice. There might be no interest in sitting meditation on their side. There might be no existential question. On the other hand, to make that decision, I'm gonna devote my whole life to this way. It's a big decision. It's easy to laugh about for us Westerners. Oh, these temple sons. They have no interest. They haven't even read the Shobogenzo. But you, okay, I read the Shobogenzo, but how deep does it go? Does it really influence your life? Or are you just using it for your Dharma talks that you're putting up on YouTube? And when I say you, I mean myself. Okay, basically what I'm trying to say here is Japanese Zen is quite different from Zen as we know it from the West, and there's very few people who enter this way because of their own decision. But actually, if you stick to the way and you practice with your Dharma brothers who are in this business for other reasons than yourself, you discover maybe also that your wholehearted decision and your determination is maybe not as pure and wholehearted as it seems to be. Okay, maybe I'm gonna come back to this topic later. Let me read a little bit from the interview. That's the fifth and last part of Edward's winter report. Muho creates Miaula, and it's the second part of this fifth part. First question by Edward. Why did the older monks reconcile with Miaula after they left the monastery? So I talked about that all of my senior Dharma brothers at one point left Antaiji. Some of them to go to another monastery and get further training, but then even after coming back to Antaiji, at one point they all fell out with Miaula, but then most of them reconciled. So the question why? My answer. You asked me if Miaula was insecure, and maybe he was. The guys that left felt betrayed by their teacher. They didn't get appreciation for the work they did. But also Miaula felt betrayed by them leaving, and this insecurity got bigger. Usually it was the first monk that left. But when time passes and there's letters exchanged and New Year's cards exchanged, Miaula would understand that that person didn't betray him. With the oldest of the monks, it was a little different. He had done Rinzai practice before he came to Antaiji. He had some kind of experience during koan practice and thought he was enlightened already. That was important to him, and he thought it was an important part of the practice. At one point, you should get this enlightenment experience, he thought. Miaula was pretty conservative, Uchiyama style. Sit for nothing. You don't need any experience. Nothing for yourself. But the oldest monk would kind of brainwash the other monks. He was also the guy who sent me to a Rinzai monastery. He'd say that there was nothing wrong with Antaiji practice if you are enlightened already. But if you don't have an enlightenment experience and just sit there for 1,800 hours a year, it's a waste of time. You need to get to that point where you jump into abyss. And at Antaiji now, there's no one that pushes you to that point. This was the reason why Jay, one of the other monks, left. He went to Bukkokuji, which is another Soto place that does koans. T went to a temple in Hiroshima called Shorinkutsu. This was all quite untypical for the Japanese. In my view, it was usually the foreigners that have this fixed idea, I need Satori. The Japanese are usually a little bit more flexible there. But both J and T, after 7 years at Antaiji, maybe came to that point where they thought they needed Satori after all. Yeah, Satori is also a topic that I might want to discuss at some point in the future. The other day I did something in German on that topic. Usually it's stressed more in Rinzai. In Rinzai, they also say there's nothing to gain, but first you need to realize that there's nothing to gain. Otherwise you will just sit there and dream with that idea in your head. There's nothing to gain. While in Soto, people will point to the fact that this realization that you have is also something that you grasp, and practice is about letting go, letting go, letting go. And if letting go becomes something personal. 5 years ago, on that day, in that location, I had this experience of letting go. It's not letting go anymore. But again, even though you might feel convinced by the Soto explanation, there's still this doubt. Yes, it now sounds nice, but first I need to really let go. I need to really let go before I can just sit. So from my experience, it's more the Westerners who have this idea, Satori, 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 but even with my Japanese Dharma brothers, after some time it came up. And yeah, everybody at one point left. And Miyaula, I think he felt betrayed at that point of time, but also they felt betrayed by their teacher, because all of us, probably all of us, when you commit to a teacher, you ordain with a teacher, you expect something from the teacher. It's different from person to person. Often it's some kind of father figure that you expect there, or maybe a more motherly figure, or you have this idea of the enlightened guru that will answer all your questions, or you hope for emotional support. You hope that there's somebody there who has time for you, who has attention for you, who will listen to you, or who will help you. And sooner or later, most or all of this is gonna be disappointed. You realize, oh, this person is not my father, he's not my mother, or she is not my mother. More often than not, they cannot answer your question. So what do you do? And yeah, in most cases, at one point, people will leave the monastery. I at one point left Antaiji. Also, somewhere at the back of my head with the idea, well, maybe there's another teacher who can do all of this for me that Miyaura couldn't. I had the feeling that for most it works like this. Although they hear in the beginning, Antaiji, practice is good for nothing. It's your practice, adult practice. You're not a baby. And you say, okay, I understand all of that. That's okay. That's exactly what I've been looking for. Once you're there, it's not so easy. And I mean, in my case, it was also this idea I had of self-sufficient practice. Probably it's the same today, maybe even stronger now that everybody's climate conscious. You want to go back to a lifestyle, permanent culture that's more environment friendly. But once you're there and you actually have a spade and a hoe in your hand, you realize it's not so hard, especially if at the same time you also want to do intensive meditation practice and you have to do all of this work. And I was a vegetarian, but then there's meat on the plate now, probably even more than 30 years ago, because there's been a huge increase of boars and deers in Japan. The hunters, which are all in their 70s now in Japan, they get money from the state for killing the animals, but nobody wants to butcher and eat them. Usually when you go to a monastery, a Buddhist monastery, you're not expecting to do that kind of work and to eat the animals, but that's actually the case. So it's quite different from what you expect, the life there and the hierarchy, the life with the rest of the community. There's quite some funky characters in a monastery, just as everywhere else in society. While we usually expect to find something in the monastery that you wouldn't find in the rest of society, and you go there and you see it's basically the same, just a little bit more concentrated, a little bit more intense, because it's 24/7 all year round. Okay, I get to the next question so that we can finish this. Edward asked me, what did the oldest monk do afterwards, after he left Antaiji? He took responsibility for his own temple. So that was one of these small 300 plus years old temples with a small parish where he would concentrate on doing funerals. When did you leave? In the autumn of 1995. So when I was 27, that was 2 years after I ordained with my teachers. That was 2 years after I joined Antaiji for good. So I was pretty desperate at the time. Of course, I knew I had to let go of this idea. There's going to be this big Satori thing. There's going to be the big answer to my question. But still, in the back of my mind, that's the idea. Well, if I let go of this idea somehow, the question is going to be solved. And of course, that idea is not completely wrong. But I was still chasing the carrot, just by pretending not to chase the carrot. I was still chasing the carrot, and was disappointed that I didn't have found the carrot. And my senior Dharma brothers were all one after the other leaving the monastery. Miyaura wasn't the big daddy or the mummy for me, would ignore me at times. So at 27 I was at the point, maybe it's time to go home to Germany, but what I would do back in Germany? I came to Japan to solve the question of my life. So that's when I went to the Rinzai monastery. Edward asks, after you ordained, Muho answers, yes, before I ordained as an exchange student in Kyoto between 1990 and 1993, I visited a lot of temples, some were Rinzai, and met some roshis just to get an overview. I had an idea of the options and what I was committing to. Somehow in my mind I knew I wanted to go to Antaiji, but still I wanted to know what other options there were. At the time I thought Antaiji was the best, so before I ordained at age 25 or so. But after 2 years I was a little bit stuck. I didn't get anywhere. I wasn't happy in the Sangha, the whole Senpai Kohai, so junior, superior system. The insufficiency of the Samu, the fact that so many monks sleep during Zazen when it's supposed to be the core of the practice. After 2 years I was first thinking of going to another Soto Zen temple. There was also a German Zen monk who was living in Shizuoka, and I thought of living with him. He was like a hermit in the mountains. But when I talked to the oldest monk about it, he was like, oh no, just go to a Rinzai place. So I went to Kyoto from 1995 until 1996. Then from 1996 to 1997 I went to Hoshinji to get my priest license. The oldest monk NJ also went there before me. Then from 1997 until 2001 I stayed again in Antaiji. These last 4 years, when I came back from Hoshinji, S, another of my seniors, seemed destined to become the next abbot. But then all this pressure came with the no takuhatsu thing. S was the one who had the idea to have 10 cows, then do the charcoal. Edward asks, you said the reason you left was because of issues with the hierarchy. Muho, well, basically it's because I thought I had no freedom here at Antaiji. Yes, I've got these 2 hours in the morning of Zazen and 2 hours in the evening. I came to Antaiji because of that and have no problems with it. But then the whole of the rest of the day I'm ordered around by people and do tenzo, the cook, which I hated. After I was tenzo, I would hate to then have to do work which was so inefficient and which I couldn't say anything about or suggest a better way. You're criticized for your cooking when you're not used to Japanese cuisine and have no idea about what a proper dashi tastes like, so the broth. Or how hard or soft an udon, the noodles, should be. I didn't go to Japan to learn how to cook. I wanted to learn about Zazen and how to live my life. The quality of the udon noodles in my mind was only secondary, but for the Japanese it was always very important. Edward, so it was just the chaos of the place at the time combined with strict hierarchy? Muho, it was chaotic, but about the same as now. If you ask monks about the practice, what they usually tell you is that in the past it was so much harder and stricter. People have been telling that story for centuries. When you are there in the beginning, that is when it's most intense. Later, when you look back on it, you think that the past was when it was hardest. But probably it's more or less the same over the years. So the amount of chaos, instability and inefficiency, I don't think it has changed so much. Okay. I thought I always think I could say more in the amount of time that I'm actually using to do these videos. But I'm gonna stop here, and next time I'm gonna talk about my experience in the Rinzai monastery. Which was for me a quite special time during my training. It's not easy to talk about it. I will say some introductory stuff about that next time. There's also English translation of a Japanese book that is about the experience of 1 year in Eheji, the Soto Shu Zen main monastery. I think the title is something like Eat, Sleep, Sit, maybe in a different order, something like that. Which is pretty much the way it's done, even today. And I think lots of Western readers are quite taken aback by when they read that kind of stuff. Well, I was never for a longer stretch of time in Eheji, but my experience in the Rinzai monastery was in some ways similar. And that means very different from what we know from Western Zen centers, but I'm gonna talk about that next time. Okay, so much for today. Sorry for talking so much as always, but thank you for watching anyway. Have a good time.